Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Again, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to come and speak to you guys again. On the topic which Irfan asked me to deal with is closely related to the subject of my PhD. So is aql really one of the sources in contemporary Shi'i fiqh? Now, I actually tried to get out of doing this topic here, and I gave some other suggestions to Irfan, because it is a technical topic. Okay, it's a technical discussion, and for 8:45 on a Friday evening, it can be a little heavy going. So I'll do my best to explain a lot of the jargon which is in there. And traditionally, in scholarly circles, discussions of usul al-fiqh, legal theory, how ahkam are interpreted and derived by the mujtahids, usually these are discussions which are kept for the scholarly elites. Right? So I'm all for having these discussions in public forums, okay? Because I don't believe in that distinction necessarily between some discussions of scholarly elites and some discussions are not. But it is technical in its nature. And maybe some of the reasons it's so technical is part of the reasons or it's part of a means of establishing that barrier. So bear with it, but I'll do my best to be as clear as I can. And I don't mind if you guys want to interrupt me as I go through the talk, okay, with questions, yeah? But of course, we'll take questions at the end as well. So is aql really one of the sources in contemporary Shia fiqh? Before we get into the main question, just some initial clarifications between what we mean by sharia ahkam, fiqh, and usul al-fiqh. There's often a confusion between sharia ahkam and fiqh, okay? Sharia ahkam, we can loosely define as the regulations coming from God, ordering the lives of humankind, all right? This is slightly different from fiqh. Fiqh is the process of inferring the religious regulation from its sources. Okay, normally we think of fiqh as being the ahkam, but in a scholarly sense, that's not the case. In a scholarly sense, fiqh is the actual process. Okay, ahkam is what we seek when we do fiqh. All right, and as you can see, ahkam I've translated here as regulations, not law. Okay, there's a big difference. We talk about Sharia law, absolutely not. Some aspects of Sharia, ahkam, are potentially legal. Okay, for example, capital punishments, inheritance, these things, if they're instituted by a state, then they become legal. All right, otherwise, ahkam is much more general than law. Only some ahkam are potentially legal. So what's usul al-fiqh? Sharia ahkam are the regulations from God ordering the lives of humankind. Fiqh is the process through which we derive these ahkam from their sources. Usul al-fiqh is the study of the common elements in this process of inference, in this process of fiqh. Okay, so if you like, the general principles of fiqh, the general principles of interpreting or deriving the ahkam from their sources. So it's in usul al-fiqh which we find the theoretical conception of dalil al-aql. Dalil al-aql, aql as a source. All right, so if we're looking for the treatment, what's the role of reason as a source of ahkam, usul al-fiqh is where we'll find, at least in theory, what this role should be. And it's here that can explain the theoretical role of aql in Shia fiqh. So our discourse, our discussion today will be centering on the treatment of al-aql in Shia usul al-fiqh. So just again, before we get into the question of al-aql and the role of al-aql in usul al-fiqh, just some general overview of the actual process of inference of ahkam, the actual process of fiqh, or if you like, ijtihad. What does a mujtahid do? How does he do it? What does he do? Very, very briefly, or what are the sources that he relies upon? So the system of ijtihad in the contemporary Shia world is basically a two-level system, or two-tier system. Yeah, in the first tier, or the first mode of analysis of the mujtahid, he tries to find the real hukam in the knowledge of God. So he has a situation or he has a question, he wants to find what's the hukam in the knowledge of God. Okay? And I'll explain this a little further. If he can't find the real hukam in the knowledge of God, or he has no source which can tell him the real hukam in the knowledge of God, he refers to a second tier of evidences and some practical principles to give him a solution to his problem. Okay? Now, in the first tier, we refer to these evidences as reality-securing evidences because they give us the real hukam. Yeah? Or at least they're attempting to give us the real hukam. What are these sources? In Shia Usul al-Fiqh, we usually list these sources as al-Kitab meaning the Quran, as-Sunnah, meaning the words, actions, and tacit approvals of the Ma'sumeen, okay, al-Ijma', okay, which is actually a means to Sunnah in Shia discourse, okay, and al-Aql, the thing which we want to ask about today, and we want to clarify further today. So these were all first-tier evidences, okay, al-Kitab, as-Sunnah, al-Ijma', al-Aql. The Mujtahid relies upon them, refers to them, to try to find out what the hukm is in the knowledge of God. Okay, so ijma here in Shia discourse is any ijma which reveals the opinion of the ma'soom. That's the criteria. Okay, so in Shia legal theory, ijma isn't an independent source. Okay, ijma is only a means to sunnah. Okay, so even if there was 3 scholars who had a certain opinion, but for some reason we were certain that one of those 3 was a ma'soom, that ijma would be authoritative. So it's not ijma which is the source of authority, it's the presence of the ma'soom. Okay, ijma in itself is not authoritative for Shias. Okay, ijma is only a means to sunnah. Okay, so actually we only have 3 independent sources. Yeah, is al-Kitab, as-Sunnah, and al-Aql. All right, thank you for the question, good question. Practical principles. So if we can't find an answer from these 3 evidences, yeah, the mujtahid goes to a second tier of evidence. All right, in here, it's in the absence of an indicator to the real hukm. So one can't find out the real hukm through these 4 sources for a number of possible reasons. I'll give an example. In such a case, you'd refer to a second tier of evidences. Okay, and these are what we call usul al-amaliyah, practical principles. Okay, and these are principles such as al-istishab, the continuity of previous certainty, or the principle of exemption or the principle of caution. Okay, and these are non-reality securing evidences. They don't actually give you the hukm in the knowledge of God. Now let me give you an example. If I was to walk into the bathroom when I get home and there's some water on the floor, I have a young boy. Okay, alhamdulillah, he's potty trained, okay, and he's got control. But in reality, I don't know whether the water is clean or unclean. Okay, now, to be honest with you, I'm not going to smell it, I'm not going to taste it, okay, and it's dark, so I can't see the color. In fiqh, we have these, in the ahkam is the taste, color, smell are indicators, all right? I'm not going to taste it, okay? I don't know whether it's tahir or not. Okay, Allah knows. Allah knows whether it's najis or whether it's tahir. Okay, I don't know. Quran isn't going to tell me. Ijma isn't going to tell me. Okay, I haven't got one of these special pH indicators in my pocket to tell, okay, whether it really is, najasa or not. Okay, so what do? I rely on a practical principle. And here we have a principle of tahara, which says, kullu shay'in tahirun hatta ta'lamu annahu najisun. Everything, literally this is, everything is tahir, everything is clean, until you know that it is najis. Okay, but in reality it's not. In reality the tradition is saying, consider everything to be tahir until you know that it is najis. Okay, so God is saying you can assume it to be tahir if you don't know. If it is actually najis, God knows. So you see, I've got a hukam here that water I can consider to be tahir. Yeah, but this is not necessarily the real hukam. Okay, so you can see how this is very different from the first tier of evidences. If I can't find the real hukam, there are other means of resolving my practical situation. I'm in doubt. Okay, I don't know whether it's time for fajr yet. Okay, I'm wondering, has the sun started to rise? Has it not? I haven't got a watch. I'm unsure. Okay, all right, the Quran can't tell me whether it's time for fajr or not. Ijma can't tell me whether it's time for fajr or not. The Sunnah doesn't tell me whether it's time for fajr or not. So what do? I would apply this principle of previous certainty. I'll say, I was certain it wasn't time for fajr. Okay? So at the moment, I have to consider it's still not time for fajr. Okay? And there I would get an apparent law which says, no, it's still not time for fajr. Okay? So these are basically second-tier evidences which the mujtahid applies, and they're very practical even in everyday life, in the couple of examples which I've just given you, to give us a solution to our absence of knowledge. And it's still a hukam. Okay? Yeah, we say the hukam here is you can consider that water tahir. You can consider it tahir. Whether it is or not, Allah knows. All right? Second tier of evidence. So these are non-reality securing evidences. So these are means to a practical standpoint when the real hukm is unknown. Right. Now, as we saw, al-aql, which is our focus today, was listed alongside the Quran and Sunnah as a first tier evidence, as a reality securing evidence, okay? A means to actually knowing the hukm in the knowledge of God. Now, the inclusion of al-aql in the first tier is linked to the adliya, rationalist meta-ethics, which we discussed in the last talk, okay? That adliya, Shias, and Mu'tazila, who have this substantive conception of justice, okay, adhere to a moral rationalism. What's this moral rationalism? What's this theory about the nature of ethics? Very, very briefly, is that moral values are independent to God's commands and that they can be understood by human reason. And we gave some classical arguments for it last time I had the opportunity to speak with you guys. So the inclusion of aql is intimately linked with this theological principle. And it gives us the impression that rational morality, okay, should be a substantive, independent source of Sharia ahkam. Okay, and it also gives us the impression that rational morality should be a condition for the validity of any textually derived precepts which we attribute to a just God. We say that, yeah, if morality is rational, reason is a source of law, then if there's a hukam which has been derived by a mujtahid, which seems to conflict rational morality, we can't attribute this to God. So if we have an immoral hukam, or something which seems immoral, how can we attribute this to a moral God? Yeah, and from the discussion last time, this is where all the questions were. This was the discussion point, yeah, because we talked about this, and then everybody said, okay, hang on a moment, what about all of this stuff? Yeah, okay, so this is where we get to look at this a little bit further today, or explain why we're still having problems here, despite accepting this as fundamental to the Shia theological system. Right, so the implications of a rational morality, if rational morality is a substantive source, okay, a substantive source and a qualification for the interpretation of textual evidences, we would be able to address the legal positivism in Sharia discourse. What do we mean by legal positivism? A detachment of fiqh validity from morality. And we're seeing this everywhere. Okay, in Islamic banking and finance, we find contracts which are apparently fiqh compliant. They tick the boxes of being legal, but they don't lead to any of the moral goals of Islamic economics. Okay, or in fact, they actually seem to lead to more immorality than the capitalism which we're exposed to in the mainstream market. Okay, so what's going on? Okay, we have a detachment of validity from morality. Okay, and this has implications in Islamic banking and finance, Islamic political theory. Other areas of implications for this moral rationalism would be the questions of human rights. Rational morality could be or should be, it seems intuitively, to be a trump for the interpretations of texts. In cases of women's rights, family law, apostasy, we'd say, okay, a single text says if somebody changes their religion, kill them. So how can you attribute this to a moral God? Okay, so these questions, we feel that rational morality should give us a tool to deal with these problems Muslims are facing. However, Shia fiqh is not different from any other school on these questions. All right, despite having this fundamental theological resource of a rational morality and a space for reason in its legal theory. So despite the theological and jurisprudential resources, Shia fiqh is as problematic with respect to human rights as any other Muslim normative system, and this legal positivism is as rampant, okay, as it is in any other Muslim legal system. Now, examining the theoretical conception of al-aql in usul al-fiqh can help us understand why. And I guess that's part of our aim today. So, al-aql in early Shia usul al-fiqh, from the very formative period of Shia, or the systematization of Shia usul al-fiqh, al-aql was a serious concern. Okay, and during this early period of Sharif al-Murtaza, Sheikh al-Mufid, Sheikh al-Tusi, okay, there was extensive references to al-aql in their legal theory. But it was a little bit of ambiguous in how the term was being used, because it was being used for many different it was used in many different ways. For example, Shaykh al-Mufid talks about al-aql as being a means to establish Quran and Sunnah and a means to interpret Quran and Sunnah. Sharif al-Murtaza, Shaykh al-Tusi, they talk about al-aql in the context of being a source alongside Quran and Sunnah, and then in some cases after Quran and Sunnah. All right? And we see rational morality being talked about explicitly in the terms of husn and qubh, okay, praiseworthy and blameworthy. And we talk about rational excusability being referred to as dalil al-aql. Now these two, in terms of our first tier and second tier, this rational morality is first tier. Rational excusability is a second tier evidence. We're excusable if we don't know. Okay, so we see that the early jurists, they were talking about dalil al-aql, but they used dalil al-aql in many, many different ways. All right, so the term didn't have conceptual, wasn't sharply defined. Okay, of exactly when they used dalil al-aql, it takes some work to understand in which way do they mean dalil al-aql. Right, as time passed on, okay, and with most disciplines it's the case, okay, as knowledge expands, okay, terms tend to be used in a more defined and systematic manner. And we found two categories of dalil al-aql being sharply demarcated from each other. And this sharp demarcation, or this increased conceptual clarity, especially over the conception of rationality, okay, occurs during and after the Akhbari Usuli polemics, okay, of the 18th century, all right? And the concept of dalil al-aql, reason as source, was sharpened up. And it makes sense that this was going to happen because one of the major attacks of the Akhbaris against the Usulis was about their use of rationality, and a loose use of rationality, or a loose reference to rationality. So post-Akhbari Usuli polemics, we now have a sharp definition of dalil al-aql. Okay, what's this definition? Dalil al-aql literally means aql as a source, yeah, or aql as an indicator to Sharia. What's the definition? We have any rational proposition which leads to certainty in a Sharia precept. So any rational proposition which leads to certainty in a Sharia hukam. This is dalil al-aql. And this can then be divided into two categories. Dependent rationality, or what they call ghayr mustaqillat al-aqliya, non-independent rationality, and al-mustaqillat al-aqliya, independent rationality. To understand this difference a little bit better, okay, it's good to just remind ourselves of the massive influence of syllogistic reasoning in Muslim scholarship. Okay, what do I mean by syllogistic reasoning? Okay, the Usulis adopt, and not just the Usulis actually, Muslim scholarship per se, but especially the Usulis, adopt principles of logic which state that reliable inference, so reliable reasoning, relies upon or is even restricted to deductive syllogistic reasoning. Okay, what do I mean? To give a very, very brief and simple example, you know, they were relying on formal syllogisms, and still they rely on formal syllogism, at least theoretically. Okay, this Aristotelian logic, okay, still plays a massive, massive influence in the theories of knowledge of Muslim scholarship. So an example of a formal syllogism, Sarah is a human being, minor premise. Okay, a syllogism has a minor premise, a major premise, and a conclusion. Sarah is a human being, major premise, humans are rational animals, therefore, Sarah is a rational animal. Okay, it's an example of a deductive, logical syllogism. All right, now, with that in mind, how do we distinguish between dependent rationality and independent rationality? Okay, so for the Usuliyun, dependent rationality is where the syllogism, okay, which we're using to infer the hukam, has only part of that syllogism is purely rational. Okay, it's dependent on a shi'i premise. All right, and the example hopefully will make it clear. So only one of these premises, the minor and the major, is a product of a rational judgment. For example, Hajj is wajib on the mustati', is wajib upon the one who has capability. This is a shi'i premise. We get this from the verse of the Quran. Okay, then we have a rational premise, which says the necessary prerequisites of an obligation are rationally also an obligation. Okay? This is a rational proposition, that the necessary prerequisites, what I have to do to discharge an obligation, is also an obligation. Right? This is a rational premise. Okay? It doesn't say this anywhere in the Quran or the Sunnah. It's rational. Okay? If my dad says, park the car, Yeah, okay. I said, okay, my dad's an authority over me. I'm going to park the car. It means I have to pick up the keys from the table to take it to the car. It's a rational obligation that the prerequisites to the obligation are also part of the obligation. Okay, so this is a purely rational premise. The conclusion would be that thus the necessary prerequisites for Hajj are also a religious obligation upon the one with capability, upon the mustati. So for example, someone reaches the financial, social, psychological capability to perform Hajj. Yeah, okay, it's now wajib upon them. Yeah, an active wujub. All right? Is it wajib upon him to get his visa? To travel to the airport? Okay, to go to Makkah? Is it? Does it say this in the Quran? How did we know it was wajib?
There is a story and us in principle. Muqaddimatul wajib, wajib.
Asant. Okay, the prerequisites of a wajib are wajib, but where's this asal from? This is the asal. Is this asal stated in a text or is it a rational asal? Okay, it's a rational asal. Okay, so here we have a shari'i precept, a rational principle, which gives us another shari'i precept, that the prerequisites for us to actually discharge our Hajj is also wajib. Okay, this is dalil al-aqal ghayr mustaqil, non-independent rationality. And if we go back to our original definition of dalil al-aqal, we say any rational proposition which leads to a shari'i precept. This is a rational proposition, it's led to a shari'i precept, but it's not independent rationality. Okay, we can ask here, yeah, very, very reasonably, that here is aqal a source, or is it simply an interpretive tool? Interpretive tool. And we'll see that many of the early usuliyun, they actually classify this question of muqaddimat al-wajib, the prerequisites of an obligation, as part of the linguistics discussions within usul al-fiqh. Okay, so actually this is interpreting this textual evidence. Okay, but we're using aqal to interpret it. Yeah? Now, this is just one example of dependent rationality, what's classified as dependent rationality or non-independent rationality. But this type of use of reason as an interpretive tool or as a non-independent tool is extensive in Shia usul al-fiqh. Okay, now across Muslim schools of jurisprudence, schools use this type of rational interpretation to different extents. All right, but in Shia usul al-fiqh, this type of dependent rationality is used extensively. Okay, but as we rightly ask here, I think by your nods, most of you would agree with me, it seems like we're using reason to interpret this rather than reason as a source. Independent rationality, this is the stuff we say, no, this is the source. Because remember, al-aql was listed alongside Quran and Sunnah in that first tier. Okay? So this is the one we're interested to find out what's happening here with dalil al-aql. Now this is the case where both the minor premise in our syllogism and the major premise in our syllogism are both rational. Okay, and if we have a case where both the minor premise and the major premise is rational, this leads us to a rational conclusion about the Sharia, then this would be an independent use of reason to take us to a Sharia hukm. What's the classical example? Oppression is blameworthy according to al-aql. Okay, yeah? Zulm is kabih, aqlan. Whatever, rationally, whatever is blameworthy according to al-aql is blameworthy according to ash-shar. Whatever is rationally blameworthy is blameworthy according to religion. Okay, minor premise, major premise. This would give us a conclusion. Therefore, oppression is blameworthy according to ash-shar. Okay, so we say minor premise is rational, major premise is rational, conclusion is rational. Now, if we were to accept both of these premises, the reasoning is sound, we have to accept the conclusion. All right? This would be a case of independent rationality leading us to a judgment of Sharia ahkam. But for the inclusion of al-aql as an independent source of Sharia, and for us to accept such examples, we need to say yes to 4 questions. Okay, we need to deal with 4 questions. And this is where we start getting a little bit more complicated, all right? Yeah, so again, if you want to interrupt me to clarify, please do, okay? We need to say yes to 4 questions. First of all, are actions in themselves either hasan or kabih? Are actions either moral or immoral in themselves? Okay, then if we say yes, they are, is reason capable of understanding the moral value of acts? Okay, now these were the questions we discussed last time. Yeah, okay, about the moral rationalism being fundamental to Shia theology. And we gave some arguments, classical arguments for that. Okay, but once you've said yes to this theological presupposition, these are theological questions. You've then got two more questions. Okay, we'll look at these in a little bit more detail. Okay, if we say that yes, some actions are either good or bad in themselves. For example, oppression is bad. Okay, telling the truth if all things are equal is good. Yeah, okay, we don't need Allah to tell us that or to define that. No, it is. Yeah, and then we say that no, in some circumstances, reason can understand this independently without revelation. So we've said yes to 1 and 2. Then the question comes, okay, does the understanding of rationality correspond to the judgment of the divine legislator? Okay, does my judgment that this is good or this is bad, does it correspond to God's judgment that this is good or this is bad? Okay, because we want to find out Sharia hukam, not Aql's hukam. Yeah? Okay, then if we say yes, it does correspond. So the judgment of reason does correspond to the judgment of God. And so I found out a judgment of God through the judgment of reason. There's then a further question which the Usuliyun discusses. Is knowledge of God's hukam accessed in this way? Is it authoritative? Can I rely upon it in my practical life? All right, and we'll, peel the onion of these two questions a little bit further as we go on, okay? So, the first two questions are about the nature of morality. Okay, questions 1 and 2 refer to moral ontology, okay, the nature of morality and moral epistemology. Can we discover these values or not? How do we discover them? And we discussed this stuff last time. And this is a question which is between ilm al-kalam, between theology, and actually, in a modern sense, it's a question of moral philosophy. All right? Having said that, these questions have received sophisticated treatment by Usuli Shias. And we see radical differences amongst them on the questions of moral ontology, the nature of morality. Okay? And quite exciting contributions to moral philosophy, actually. And despite those differences about moral ontology, there's a broad agreement on moral epistemology. Okay, that rationality, reason can understand moral values, can understand basic moral values, and we argued last time this is fundamental to our theology. And what's the agreement? The agreement is that some basic moral propositions can be understood by reason without revelation. And I'm not going to give the argumentation for this now because we discussed those in the previous lecture. Question 3 and 4 are the jurisprudential ones. They're the usuli questions. Does the question 3 that I've already mentioned briefly is, does the judgment of rational morality correlate? Does my judgment that this is moral or this is immoral, can it correlate to the judgment of the divine legislator? And if so, is the knowledge of Sharia precepts attained this way? Is it authoritative? First of all, let's look at the question of correlation. So this is a correlation between al-aql and ash-shar. Yeah, what they call qa'idat al-mulazima. Yeah, okay. Now the existence of a correlation, in principle, is seen as a distinctive feature of the Usuli school. Now the particularities of this correlation between rationality and shar, or the judgment of reason and the judgment of the divine legislator, and how it actually works, depends upon the conception of the nature of morality the respective Usuli takes. All right, so there's differences in the way Usulis argue for a correlation, and when they argue for a correlation based on their conception of morality. Now here, all we're going to do is examine one of the such views. Yeah, and the view of Muhakkik Muhammad Reza Muzaffar, a very, very important 20th century Usuli Shia. And I think it's not just because of Sheikh Muzaffar's importance in his own right, but Sheikh al-Fayyaz, one of the contemporary Maraja of the day, has cited that Sheikh Muzaffar's opinion about the correlation is the popular mashhur opinion of the day. So it seems like a reasonable place to examine. Another reason why it's interesting to examine his reading is he actually has, in theory, a very optimistic view of the correlation. But still we'll see that it leads to redundancy of aql in actual practice. So if the optimistic ones, lead to redundancy in practice, then we can imagine about the spectrum in between. Right, so Sheikh Muzaffar on rational morality. Sheikh Muzaffar adopts his teacher Isfahani's, Muhakkik Isfahani's reading of Ibn Sina's position. It's a disputed reading of Ibn Sina, but a position of Ibn Sina about the nature of rational morality or rational propositions. And he says, or their position is that judgments of morality, judgments of husn and qubh, rational judgments of morality, these refer to nothing else apart from the concurrence of rational beings upon the morality of actions. What they're saying husn and qubh equals the concurrence of rational beings upon morality, that every rational person agrees. Okay, something is a rational principle of morality if all rational beings agree that it is moral or agree that it is immoral. I see people rubbing their heads now, you know? Yeah? Okay, so Mudaffar on the correlation. Yeah, he says that now if we have any concurrence of rational beings, if we do have a concurrence where all rational beings agree that something is moral or something is immoral, then according to Mudaffar and Isfahani, this necessarily reveals a correlation to the opinion of the divine legislator. Why? Because? Anybody want to suggest why? If we have a concurrence of all rational beings that something is moral or something is immoral, why would this correspond to the opinion of the divine legislator? Sorry? Ahsant, yes. Well done. Excellent. Because divine legislator is one of the rational beings. All right? And in fact, quoting Sheikh Muzaffar directly, yeah, he is the chief rational being. He's Ra'is al-Uqala. Okay, he's the creator of al-Aqal. Okay, so if all rational beings concur, then for sure this reflects God's opinion. So, to get al-Aqal as an independent source of Sharia, let's go back to our 4 questions. We said, yeah, questions 1 and 2, a question of moral philosophy, theology. We dealt with them last time. Does the judgment of reason correspond to the judgment of divine legislator? If we have concurrence of the rational beings, yes. Okay? According to Sheikh Muzaffar, because God is rational. Yeah, so eloquently put. Now we're left with a further question. Is knowledge of a Sharia precept acquired in this way? Is it authoritative? Can I rely upon it? Or is access to Sharia ahkam, ones which I can rely upon, is that exclusively the role of Quran and Sunnah? So is it authoritative? Is it hujjah? Question of hujjah is a central question of usul al-fiqh. Actually, you could say this is the central preoccupation of the mujtahid and the usuli. Because they want to say that, is my deduction, is my inference authoritative? Is it going to give me an excuse before God even if I'm wrong? Yeah? Okay? Or they don't actually so much care whether they're right or wrong. Yeah? What they want to know is, am I excusable? And are my followers excusable? Yeah? Question of hujjah is critical. Okay, so what do we mean by hujjah in a technical sense? Yeah, does knowledge acquired in this way, okay, actualize responsibility? So if I found out a hukam in this way, would I be responsible to it? Okay, and if I'm wrong with that hukam, would I be excused before God? To say, look, I followed valid evidence, okay, and I got it wrong. Yeah, and am I going to be excused before God? Munajjaziya and mu'adhariya. Now, for the contemporary framework of usul al-fiqh post Shaykh al-Ansari, the ultimate criteria for hujjiyah, for authority of sources, is certainty. Okay, now certainty in the usuli paradigm, okay, is 100% certainty. Absolute disclosure. In what the inkishaf al-waqi', right? A source, any source, now this is for all of those, whether they're first tier evidences or second tier evidences, yeah, is only authoritative. We can only rely upon it. We can only be excused before God in relying upon it if it gives me certainty, if it's certainty bearing, if it gives me qat in a hukam. Or if it's non-certainty bearing, I must have certain validation that God has allowed me to use this means. Right? Certainty is the ultimate criteria. So, now going back to the hujjah of al-aqal, knowledge of Sharia precepts attained by al-aqal is only authoritative if it is certain. It's only a hujjah if it is certain. I.e., we need to be certain within this system that there is a concurrence of all rational beings regarding the morality of an action for it to lead to a authoritative Sharia hukam. Now, the concurrence of all rational beings occurs, if anything, only in the most basic of moral propositions. And this leads us to the redundancy of independent rationality in fiqh. Because rationally, we can say that rationally, according to the divine legislator, according to Ash-Shari', we can say that, yep, justice is praiseworthy. And we can say that, yep, we have concurrence on such issues. Oppression is blameworthy. But these are too basic to have any relevance when it comes to fiqh. Okay, we're not certain what constitutes an instance of injustice. So we can say, yes, oppression is definitely blameworthy. But is a woman not having a unilateral right to divorce despite being beaten, despite being raped, is that an instance of injustice or not? Some people might say, yeah, 99% it is. Some might say, no, 60% it is, 70% it is. Yeah? Not certain. Okay, is somebody not having freedom of conscience to change his religion, okay, without being threatened by death? Is that a case of oppression or not? We'd say, can we be certain? So no, we can be certain that oppression is blameworthy. We can be certain that justice is praiseworthy, but we can't be absolutely 100% certain about an instance of justice. This is the mainstream contemporary position of the day amongst the Maraji. Okay? Yeah, well, they say we can know husn and qub bil ijmal, in summary. Okay, but we don't know it bit tafsir. We don't know its instances. Or we can't be certain in its instances. So again, we submit to the interpretation of texts. So we see there's epistemic obstacles. The obstacles are about our theory of knowledge, okay, which render al-aql redundant as an independent source in the practical endeavor of fiqh. So to just sum it up, why is al-aql not acting as a source in contemporary fiqh? Now, when I'm saying this, I'm giving a very stereotypical view. There's diversity. There always has been diversity amongst the ulama, amongst usuliyun. Yeah? I'm trying to reflect a mainstream position. Okay, so there are usulis who are differing, okay, on the majority of what I've said. But this is a very good reflection of the mainstream position, all right? So just that qualification. Yeah, why is al-aql not acting as a source in contemporary fiqh, not acting as an independent source? Remember I said as a dependent source, it has massive implication. As an interpretive tool, rationality is used extensively by Shia usuliyuns. But as an independent source, Shia theology does create space for it. Yeah, because the same premises are fundamental to Shia theology. This theoretical space is acknowledged in usul al-fiqh, hence the four sources. Yeah, kitab, sunnah, ijma, and al-aql, first tier sources. Okay, but the ideas about the nature of knowledge and the criteria for the validity of knowledge are so high that independent rationality actually becomes redundant. And usuli Shiaism, as a result, is as textualist as any other school of Muslim jurisprudence. So I'll leave it open for question and answers there, and I hope it was clear. Please. Do you mind if I sit now?
Thank you for your discussion.
You're welcome.
It was very good.
Thank you.
You mentioned some example, I think. First one that regarding that if a man wants to divorce his wife, or his rape or something like this that you mentioned. I think this is the differences between fuqaha in this matter.
Absolutely.
When you say, when a husband married from the man wife and they marry a woman, or then the condition is to pay her what the mahriya, what this is called it. And it is a contract. So the woman on that time, she can ask the man if he agree to put in the contract that she can divorce herself if something happened, as it is now occurring in Iran. They mean 12, 15, condition, perhaps it is more now, that is she can't divorce her husband. This is nothing. Or regarding someone who wants to change his belief, a Muslim become non-Muslim, still it is differences between ulama. For example, some people, some of the Maraji thinks that if this means that he wants to start a war against Islam, this is he should be executed or something threatened. For example, Ayatollah Shahrudi, it's a really Ayatollah, not the by name. It was the head of the legislation in Iran, I mean the jurisdiction in Iran. One time he went to the, I think Japan or something like this, South Korea. I asked him, is that if someone change his belief? He said, it depends what you interpret them. So it didn't agree with this, someone should be executed. But because he was on the head of the jurisdiction in Iran, he didn't want to say it clearly because against the law of Iran itself. Recently in Iran, someone changed his belief to be a Christian and started to make what the advertisement on tabligh for the Christianity, and the court, I mean, make a decision to be executed. Ayatollah Khamenei say no indirectly, and they freed him. So this is depends. Well, the some example that you mentioned, it is not exactly the reality what is the Shia and Islam says. This is two things that I think better you do not all the present people here. And the other thing it is, we say ما حكم به الشرع حكم به العقل. This is. But there is a difference. Is really ما حكم به العقل حكم بالشرع. This is the محل اختلاف. So this is something that is a lot of discussion here. But absolutely. Thank you very much for your.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay, so thank you for the comments. All right. First of all, I'm not talking about every faqih here. Yeah, and I think I was very, very clear about that. Okay. And I've not examined any fuqaha's particular evidences on an issue here. What we're talking about in theory is whether rational morality is playing a role, okay, and why it doesn't seem to be playing as big a role in the vast majority of fuqaha's opinions. All right. Now there are clearly an increasing number of fuqaha who have the position or irtidad which you talked about. Okay, that this irtidad, changing of a religion, the hukam, historical hukam, which is say somebody who changes their religion should be put to death, is in a context of treachery and treason. Okay, not just a change in moral conscience, not just a decision of conscience. Okay, so I accept that Ayatollah Muntaziri is another example. Okay, many of the people who are coming to that opinion is because they believe certainly autonomy in the choice of religion is morally good. Hence, this is having an effect for them. Okay, so it's through such reasoning that they're reinterpreting that historical hukam. Okay, in the case of unilateral divorce, I'm not denying that women have a right to, in the mainstream fiqh, women have a right to add stipulations, and women have a means to buy themselves out, literally, of their contract, yeah, through khula. Okay, but what we were asking was, and I'm not saying it should be a hukam or not, what we're saying is that the question of whether it's immoral, okay, or unjust that a woman doesn't have an equal right to divorce. She may have means to divorce, and she does have means to divorce, okay? But we're just asking the question whether she has an equal right to divorce or not, okay? Why hasn't this moral question been considered by the fuqaha despite this moral rationalism? Yes.
You can stay in my home for 6 months
sure.
or 6 years.
I agree it's a contract, but I don't want to get into a fiqh debate, actually. I don't want to get into a fiqh debate, but if you don't mind me coming back, yeah, is that within that fiqh contract, the asal in the contract, yeah, is that it's not a unilateral right, it's not an equal right for divorce. Okay, the default, okay, is it's not an equal right to divorce. In the contract, she can agree, she can disagree. She doesn't have to accept the contract. Okay, but then we could ask subsequently, is it moral, is it immoral? Okay, there may be, rationally, there may be good Sharia reasons why this is the case. I'm not arguing for that. There may be wonderful Sharia reasons why this isn't the case, and this is absolutely justified. Okay, but why hasn't this question of morality seemed to have had extensive effect in this question? Because of these issues of certainty. Okay, this question was put to Ayatollah Tabrizi with this example of divorce. And he gave this response. We know husn and qub bil ijmal. We don't know it bil tafsil. Okay, so that's fine, you know. So I agree. And again, to come back on the question of the correlation, this kullu ma hakama bihil shar, hakama bihil aqal, and هل كل ما حكم به العقل, does everything which is judged by reason also be judged by divine legislation? So according to Mudhaffar, anything which is universally judged by rationality in the context of morality does correspond. So I agree, this question of the correlation is a sophisticated, detailed discussion. Yeah? And I've tried to summarize it here. Yeah? But amongst the range of opinions which accept the correlation, yeah, why doesn't it seem to have extensive effect? There's many fuqaha which are moving. Sana'i seems to be doing it because of Husn al-Qub. Ayatollah Mutahhari seem to be moving because of these questions of Husn al-Qub, because the theological resources are there in Shi'ism. Yeah, so this is something we should be proud of in our heritage, that we have this means and the fuqaha are active. Okay, and they are active and they're working towards these issues, and hence we have this diversity of approaches which the brother was mentioning. I don't want to undermine Shia fiqh here, okay, at all. Yeah, we're trying to just explain some of the reasoning process behind the hukam. And I hope I've done it in a relatively clear way.
That's pretty good. Just one comment that normally, sorry.
Can we have Ali next, please? Thank you very much.
Welcome.
So, independent rationality has a very high threshold it needs to cross before it becomes an authoritative, something authoritative. What I want to know is, interpretation requires a certain amount of rationality from the actual texts. So what sort of threshold do they give that? Because you can ask 100 people what that means and they can come up with totally different answers. And so how do they justify the fact that their interpretation of the Quran or the Sunnah is actually authoritative?
I was going to go back to a slide there. Excellent question. Okay. So we said that there's two types of evidences. The basis for authority is certainty for all evidences. Okay. So hence, what about the interpretation of text? Okay. Now there was a qualification there which says that if a source is non-certain, it must be certainly validated. Okay. So the usuliyun accept that the apparent meaning of the Quran, okay, is non-certain. They say it's dhanniyatud dalala. Okay, the Quran, right? Okay, in most cases, yeah, it's dhahir. Okay, the amount of nas where it's explicit, which its meaning gives 100% certainty. Okay, and not this possibility of multiple meanings is very, very slim. Okay, but they say we have certain arguments to say that Allah allows us to rely upon dhan here, or probable knowledge here. Okay, same with ahadith. Okay, we'll say that, yeah, the majority of hadith through which we extract this fiqhi system, okay, are that category of hadith which we call khabar wahid, okay, solitary traditions. Okay, now by definition, something is a solitary tradition if we're not certain that it has come from the Prophet and the Imams, all right, because it hasn't been transmitted by enough narrators through each generation. We talk about two types of hadith: mutawatir, like the hadith of Ghadir al-Qum. It's been translated by so many people in every generation. It's not possible that that number of people could have got together to make a lie or to make a mistake and the rest of it, yeah? So the other category of hadith is what we call khabar wahid. By definition, it's non-certain its transmission. Okay, so how do we resolve it? They resolve it by saying we have certain arguments that God is happy for us to rely upon this type of evidence. Okay? So there they say, no, we have certain evidence. I think a number of evidence say that khabar relying upon solitary narrations is, for example, okay, rational convention. Okay, it is established through verses of the Quran. Okay, it is established through the Sunnah, and they claim that these, or they argue that these arguments for the authority of the solitary tradition, which is a speculative source, is certain. So ultimately it relies on certainty. Yeah, and again, the interpretation of the Quran, they claim it's certain, has a certain base. It's a non-certain source, but its authority has a certain basis. And this has been referred to by some, because I see I'm not satisfying you, right? Okay, but that's the argument of the mainstream, all right? On the response to that, some people say that this is an epistemic discrimination. Okay, so here you manage to get certainty to validate textual evidences. Okay, but where it comes to rational evidences, okay, the dhan, here we've got probable knowledge, here we've got probable knowledge. Okay, this probable knowledge is claimed to stand on certainty. Okay, here we're saying that this probable knowledge, even if it's 99.9%, yeah, is And you can see this is why we're seeing scholars shifting, as the brother was pointing out, okay?
The Mu'tazili position on this, yeah, is it that rational deduction cannot in principle differ from divine will? I mean, what you are saying is that at the moment, the Usuli position, even the theoretical position, is that the divine will is knowable through rationality, right?
Yep.
But I understood the Mu'tazili position in saying that it cannot differ, and therefore knowability is a secondary feature.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit, in principle, they would both say that, yeah, pure al-aql as-sarih or al-aql as-salim, yeah, okay, pure rationality. That's why they want concurrence. Pure rationality can't differ with God, because God is purely rational, okay, and hence the requirement for certainty. If we know something is a pure rational judgment, okay, it's absolutely sound, then God can't, it depends, it's linguistic then, semantic. God can't differ with it, or God doesn't differ with it. Okay, yeah, that's a linguistic discussion. Now, the problem is coming, both Mu'tazili and Usuli would accept that. Okay, if we have a purely rational judgment, particularly in these questions of rational morality, and even in theoretical rationality, actually, not just practical rationality, yeah, God can't differ or doesn't differ. Yeah, but the question is, how do we know we've got a pure judgment of rationality? Yeah, how can we know this is aql as-salim? Because aql is fallible. Yeah, okay, aql is fallible. So Sheikh Mudaffar's solution was, no, if we have absolute consensus of rational beings insofar as they are being rational, then we're sure this is a purely judgment of reason, because reason is universal, it's kulli. So if we're sure this is not a particular judgment, we can be sure this is a pure rational judgment, and hence we can know that, yeah, this is a rational judgment which is corresponding with the legislator.
Happens if we go away from Aristotelian logic in fiqh?
That's for the next talk.
Okay, good. Can we get some other results out of it?
Okay, the questions are then how could these fundamental theological resources, how could reason, this space for reason as a substantive source in legal theory, how could it come to inform our fiqh? Oh, yeah? I think that's the question you're asking. Yeah? And actually this is happening. And I think the brothers pointed out some scholars where this is happening. Okay, so this movement is occurring. Right? But how can we explain it in overcoming these theoretical obstacles? A lot of it is down to this notion of certainty. All right, so some people are saying, no, we are certain that this, a pure judgment, a pure change in conscience of religion, pure change in conscience that I want to no longer be a Muslim. Nothing to do with treachery, nothing to do with renegading against the state, nothing to do with treason. It's just a choice of religion. I now decide I want to, God protect me from such a decision, but leave Islam. Yeah, okay. Many scholars saying, no, this is it. God can't condemn such a person. Yeah, and many scholars are coming to that position. It sounds like Ayatollah Shahrawardi, yeah, Ayatollah Muntaziri, okay. And they have this notion because it seems to me that they are now becoming certain that, yeah, this is immoral. All right? So one is that, okay, are people becoming certain in certain issues which they weren't certain about before, certain judgments of rationality? They're becoming so universal, okay, that we can say they're certain. For me, that's not a, I think that is, there's limits to that approach. Okay, because even if we say that, yeah, the universality of human rights or anything else, I don't accept the universality of human rights. I don't believe all human rights are absolutely certain. Okay, no, I think that, yeah, there's serious evidence to say, yeah, that, look, undermining somebody's autonomy, yeah, in choice of marital partner or in choice of religion, it seriously seems to me to be something immoral. Am I absolutely 100% certain? This notion of certainty that the Usuliyun had doesn't stand up in post-Aristotelian epistemology. Okay, so if the epistemic foundations change and we move away from that Aristotelian framework, many, many changes occur. All right, like the argument of how have we established the authority of the apparent meaning of the Quran or the authority of the khabar. Why? They say it's certainty. Well, I'll say that, no, I'm pretty sure. I think that's very strong evidence, but it's very, very strong evidence. It's still dhan, it's still probable knowledge. So if we move to a system of probable knowledge, okay, and strength of probability is the basis of authority, then we have a completely different system. Then the mujtahid, doesn't mean he'll always go with rational morality, but then he will be weighing up rational morality against the strength of textual evidences. At the moment, for the vast majority of fuqaha, these judgments of rational morality are irrelevant because they're non-certain.
Any further questions?
That judgments will become relative. So
No.
in time they would change.
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. Well, judgments have always changed over time. I brought this book for Miqdad, actually, about history and development of Imami Fiqh. Yeah, because he was working on some stuff of the change of Imami Fiqh over time. So even the first group of evidences, we're trying to find the knowledge of the hukam in the mind of God. We're trying to. Okay, these Quran, Sunnah, even if we leave Ijma and Aql, Quran, Sunnah, these are sources to the ahkam. They don't equal ahkam. Yeah, they are a means to the ahkam. Okay, so humans have always been fallible in interpreting these. So we're always trying to find it out, and it has always been changing as a result. Okay, but does this, if we move will this shift in epistemology make significant change to our fiqh system? All of a sudden, yes. And I think we're seeing those changes, actually. We're seeing those changes, okay? And why these questions about, well, I gave a couple of examples of Islamic economics, banking and finance, human rights, okay? These are problems which are not just being faced by Shias. These are being faced by all Muslims. But Shias have some serious resources within their tradition, okay, which is making them much more able to deal with these questions. And these are fundamental resources within our tradition.
In your last statement, it says that independent rationale is redundant. Does it mean we Ummah have no say in it?
Sorry?
There was a statement in your last slide.
Independent rationality is redundant
Yeah.
in Shia usul al-fiqh.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like, 'cause it's a bit stereotypical, yeah, as the brothers pointed out, right? There are changes, okay? There are changes ongoing, but in the vast majority of the frame, or in the frame, if we talk about a school of usul al-fiqh, now we're in the school of Shaykh al-Ansari. So within this paradigm, independent and rationality is redundant in Shia usul al-fiqh, okay? And I think we've got a great testimony from Shaheed Baqir al-Sadr. He says in Fatawa al-Wadhiha, in his introduction to Fatawa al-Wadhiha, that Dalil al-Aql is only a potential source, not an actual source. And I haven't referred to it in a single one of my ahkam. Okay, so it doesn't need me to be critical analysis at a university to come out with this conclusion. Shaheed Baqir al-Sadr said it before he gave his Fatawa, that it's redundant. Okay, but this is independent rationality as a source of ahkam, not the independent rationality of the ummah. So I think there's a distinction there. Okay, and so that's not the statement I was trying to make, to say that the independent rationality of the ummah is redundant, no. Okay, but independent rationality within the mainstream majority system of Shia usul al-fiqh since Shaykh al-Ansari, in my humble opinion, is redundant. Yeah, there are many, many exceptions. There are, and increasingly so. But Baqir al-Sadr, rahmatullahi alayh, has said it very, very explicitly. I don't use it. I haven't referred to a single instance. Okay. On the other hand, we see people using it as a polemical tool. This everything, we're rational. Shias are rational in our jurisprudence. Everything judged by Shar is judged by rationality. Everything judged by rationality is judged by Shar. But it's much more complicated than that. It's become a rhetorical tool. Yeah, and we'd say Baqir al-Sadr has distanced himself from that position.
What was the reason that nobody tried to change that approach?
Oh, there have been attempts to change. It has been changing, and we've always seen exceptions. Okay, with this Adliya heritage is very, very important. Fuqaha and Usuliyun have always been concerned with these questions. Okay, we see, for example, an example which comes to mind. We see it in Sharif al-Murtaza. Okay, Shaykh al-Tusi was concerned about these things. Okay, Haj Mullah Hadi Sabzwari, he talks about in his Shar' al-Asma. He has a beautiful philosophical, theological work on commentating on the Jawshan al-Kabir. And within that, he brings this discussion of Husn al-Qub. And he gives a lucid argument for rational morality, okay, and reason's ability to understand morality, okay? But then when it comes to somewhere else, when he discusses the concept of najasa and tahara, he mentions an opinion of the early Shia fuqaha, which says that not only are the kuffar najis, but they're jahannami, okay? And he says that this seems to contradict our adliya foundations of Husn al-Qub. Okay, and he engaged with it there, and he tried to work out why and how. Okay, and he came to a particular justification. So he had these questions. Sharif al-Murtaza had these questions. Shaykh al-Tusi had these questions. But there's certain times, okay, where joined up thinking becomes more important. Right? The challenges over the last 200 years, 100 years in post-colonial context, which Muslims are facing, or been very, very different from the preceding 500 years. Okay, during this Akbari Usuli challenges, people were thinking about the epistemic challenges of the Akbaris. That's where the Usuli mind was. Now we're in a position where we're facing new challenges. We're facing new circumstances. Okay, and we're trying the need for a joined up theory. We think, no, our theology needs to be consistent with our usul needs to be consistent with fiqh. There's periods through history where we see that need has been greater. And there are usually periods where we see more change. Allama Hilli's period being another case in point. We saw change, shift. We won't say a radical change, a sophistication in the theory of ijtihad, and a shift in a huge number of fiqh positions. Even the period of Shaykh al-Tusi is the same. Okay, there were certain socio-political issues which pushed scholarship to ask questions they didn't ask before. And that's the nature of knowledge, and that's the nature of change. I think we're in one of those periods right now. There's a demand for change. The ummah is not redundant. Part of this, part of this need for a change because of the demand. Okay? There's a demand for change. The average person who reads the Quran, who reads the Sunnah, who's acquainted with the life and the ethos of the Prophet and the Imams, they read some ahkam, they say, this doesn't add up. Why doesn't it add up? And same why some of the students of religion, some of the fuqaha, some of the great scholars, this doesn't add up. Why doesn't it add up? And hence we get movement.
Okay, I think we'll end there. Thank you, Ali Reza. We look forward to your second part, which inshallah will be at the beginning of next year.
I think we don't need it now with the discussion afterwards. You can let me off. Thank you for having me.
Salawat.